You are in the ring with Hector Colon, 7-time national boxing champion turned nonprofit president and CEO. Hector knocks out the big issues facing social services today with high impact leaders from around the U.S. In the Ring is a creation of Lutheran Social Services of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan and is produced by No Studios. And now, here's Hector Colon.
Hello, 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 and welcome to In the Ring with Hector Colon, that show that gets real about the challenges facing the social services sector and the people we serve. Here's the bottom line: pay is not commensurate to the value our colleagues provide society. The policies and the resources are not advancing quick enough in order to address the real needs of the people we serve. And the financial viability of our sector is in jeopardy. It's not a fair fight. That's why this year we're going to take on these issues with people at the center of these challenges, true champions who are willing to get into the ring with me. As my coach Shorty used to say, let's go, champ. In the ring with me today is Tracy Wareing-Evans. Tracy is the president and CEO of the American Public Human Services Association, a bipartisan national membership organization representing the cabinet level leadership at state and local health and human service agencies and subject matter experts that help execute their mission to improve outcomes for people nationwide. Tracy, in coordination with its governing board, sets the strategic direction for the association and spearheads delivery on its mission, which is to advance the well being of all people by influencing modern approaches to sound policy, building the capacity of public agencies to enable healthy families and communities, and connecting leaders to accelerate learning and generate practical solutions together. I have to say, I was able to witness this firsthand when I was the director of Health and Human Services for Milwaukee County. It was great to be close to Tracy and really learn from her through those efforts. Tracy has a long history in high policy development and public administration. She served as a senior advisor to U.S. Department of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano before moving to Washington, D.C. in 2009 as the director for their Arizona Department Economic Security and Integrated Human Services Agency. I would definitely like to follow up with you on your service with Secretary Janet Napolitano. That must be very interesting. Tracy is also a career litigator. She served as on more than 25 boards and advisory committees over the course of her career, serving on several national appointments. Her current board services include Social Current and WorkRise. In 2019, she was selected as a fellow to the National Academy of Public Administration. Tracy, you are an outstanding leader, a great partner, and a dear friend. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Hector.
Thank you. Thank you. Are you ready for round one, Tracy?
I'm ready.
Great. Let's go. So, I want to start off with round one, where I want to kind of summarize some of the things that I talked in my previous episodes with Susan Dreyfus and Kathleen Markland and Charlotte as well from Lutheran Services in America. We talked about some of the challenges and opportunities, and some of the things they said regarding the challenges. We talked about staff pay, we talked about funding, inequities, intergenerational poverty, antiquated policies, lack of prevention dollars, lack of affordable housing, trauma, infrastructure investments or lack thereof. You know, some of the opportunities we talked about were analytics to inform and guide the decision making, the broader involvement of social determinants of health, funding for prevention, mergers and acquisitions, the use of peer supports, 24/7 care, and neurosciences. So, Tracy, any additional challenges or opportunities that you want to share, or would you like to expand on any of these things that I already mentioned?
Yeah, well, thanks, Hector, again for inviting me to In the Ring. It's really fun to be with you. And, I think what a great way to kick off this round one with a synthesis of your previous guests. It's super helpful to me And I guess I think I'd like to add maybe a few points that build on the conversation. And, for kind of further context for your listeners, I was listening to you. It's always embarrassing to have someone read your bio to you, but I was thinking about my career, and really what's embedded behind all that is a deep belief in the need to build cross sector and cross system relationships and understand the conditions that honor the personal agency of people and enable families and communities to thrive. So underneath that kind of public sector time and space has been this real interest in building a bridge, and in building a bridge to organizations like Lutheran Social Services, where are part of really a vibrant social services sector, and being connected to that community is so important. So when I think about the challenges and opportunities that are in front of us right now, and listening to what you just summarized, I would say yes to all of them, and add maybe a little bit of additional context of thinking about what we're all up against when we think about the world today. What are the forces at play in the broader landscape, as well as within the field of social services? And, the challenges are, I think, that we have lived for too long with a fairly, if not significantly negative narrative about how people see human services, social services, and it gets in the way of our progress. And what do I mean by that? There's a lot that comes up, I think, when you're talking about this space and the general public in particular, that raises these us versus them, or deserving and undeserving thinking. And, I think we have to realize how detrimental that is to the progress we want to make, that kind of movement towards our North Star. Too often, the narratives reinforce systemic bias and structural racism, and they certainly undercut the strength of the people and the organizations who are responsible for delivering social services. And since I work on the public sector side, but all of that is in a continuum to community-based organizations, I will, also raise that the distrust in government right now has rapidly intensified across the nation, really probably with and through as a result of the pandemic. And local governments themselves, who may have been less susceptible to some of these critiques, have now found themselves in the center of a highly charged kind of public. And I think we can't ignore that distrust in systems goes beyond how that shows up for public sector leaders. It also impacts the broader set of social service delivery system and communities that, regardless of whether they're government funded or grassroots driven. And so I think at a time when the demand on us is high, and we know that there's a lot of noise out there in that narrative and that distrust, and you mentioned, worker pay, and you have to think about that in the context of the great migration, right? That we're all experiencing. And you layer that on community based organizations and public human service agencies who've always struggled, I think, to be able to attract and retain staff given the historic underinvestment in the field. It's like all of that's the noise, right? And so I think about how do we understand that so that we're very present and aware of it, but also resist falling into some of those negative narratives, and particularly in the ways that they can divide the sector. And what I mean by that is divide public servant leaders with social servant leaders, and thinking about the opportunity really, I think, is that the pandemic in particular revealed just how interconnected we are as people, from our neighborhood schools, our grocery stores, our childcare access, our health and community supports. And we have, I think, meaning government and community based social service organizations, as well as philanthropy and a lot of private organizations, we have an opportunity because of what's been revealed in that interconnectedness to really flip that script and change that narrative, which I think will make so many other things that we want to have happen. And so I just always am drawn back to understanding how people hear the story of the work we do and how we can start to shape that differently.
Thank you, Tracy. You mentioned this issue of distrust. it could be a really big problem in our sector, in our industry, just with all of the partners that are involved in everything that we do. Any ideas of how we can garner more trust amongst all the parties to really advance and move health and well-being for all involved?
Well, I think one of the things is public sector leaders, as well as those who are leading in community and on the ground, but particularly, I guess I'm making this call to public sector leaders, is to ask, how are you actually showing up in community? When are you engaging with the many organizations that you rely on to meet your mission, who are, more than providers of service? There are folks who are proximate to people on the ground. And, are you only showing up when you're announcing a new RFP or evaluating a program? Or are you constantly asking of community, what do you need? What's important to you? What's a priority? And are you visible? And I think, you know, the most inspirational places where I think there's really solid progress being made in communities because of a strong public private partnership, is where leaders, set aside really some of those pieces of ownership and really come together in a shared mission, right, and create the space for that. And so I do think that there's, and maybe we can talk a little later about some specific examples, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in that.
Great, Tracy. How about COVID and just equity, diversity, inclusion issues that have surfaced, especially over the last 2 years? Have any of these issues exacerbated the problem? And what ideas do you have around, addressing those issues straight on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I flip it to what's the collective learning experience over the past 2 years, I think that COVID, as well as the greatly expanded calls for racial justice, have brought to light just how important consistently thinking about the data in communities at a local level and applying, for lack of a, I guess, better term, an equity lens on how we see information about people. I mean, we often talk about the importance of data and analyzing it and using analytics, and all of those things are incredibly important. But if we aren't constantly thinking about how to disaggregate that data, know who's in it, and that these are people, not just pieces of information, I think there's a lot of opportunity in that. And clearly, communities that did this well over the last couple of years very quickly saw where inequities were occurring, particularly oftentimes for communities of color, and then we're able to redirect and think about resources differently. That has to not be something, though, that we're just doing in the moment of crisis. It's got to be, systematic and intentional, and something that I think public sector leaders, at least those that I'm in regular communication with, it's the top of their mind every day, and it needs to be, in terms of how we think about shifting systems to really work for all people, and what that will take for us to do that together.
Yeah, the COVID pandemic is certainly something that we have never seen in our lifetime, and it was a major disruption in our lives, and it really affected our sector in a profound way. But what would you say are what are some of the silver linings? I've been really inspired by many people all across the country of how they've risen above and beyond this disruption with COVID, and just has really have done some great things. Would you like to share some of those things that you are aware of and some of those silver linings?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many that are, I think, inspirational, but also practical. There were some things that happened in the early days of the pandemic, when obviously there was significant shutdown of activity and many people displaced from their employment. But when you step back and look at what happened, you had first of all, I think the systems that themselves that we work in were in many ways far more responsive than we thought they were, and resilient, right? So being able to move to virtual type of settings, and not just how staff in an organization might have been connecting with each other, but how people were actually connecting to people in communities. There are a couple of counties in Western Maryland that I'm familiar with that um, very quickly combined their human services public sector leaders in coordination with their community action agencies, which are essentially nonprofit community based organizations. And they moved quickly to get Wi Fi into areas and communities that didn't have it to address a lot of older people who were very much at risk of social isolation. And in that same communities, they opened their Head Start facilities when they were actually convening and opened them at night so that families could access internet, both and sometimes in employment as they were looking for employment services and just needed greater access. So, two things that happened because a public and private sector said we have to move quickly on this and create space. And there's dozens and dozens of those kind of stories that to me also lift up what is that. So that was an immediate answer, right? But what's the longer term answer there? So, I'm familiar with the state of Oregon who um, during early days of the pandemic realized that people needed laptops, but they'd never allow the provider who was providing services of employment to purchase laptops for people. They were always loaners, right? Which really made no difference to a family member who had to, check it out or go get it. And instead, now the community provider now regularly knows they can purchase laptops for people who are looking for employment. I mean, really simple things like that that are now embedded in practice because that's the way it should have been in the first place.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for sharing those insights. And it's really encouraging to see that even in the midst of the major disruption, the major challenges, there are those silver linings, and people have innovated and have done some really creative things. So it's very inspiring to hear their story. So that brings this round to a close. Next, we're going to talk about some game changers in our sector that will allow us to quickly address the needs of our community. All right, Tracy, this is going to be an exciting round. Are you ready?
Bring it on, Hector.
Awesome. Tracy, what policy changes could be game changers, and what is the fuel to get us there?
Oh, well, Hector, you know that this is right up my alley. I love the policy conversations. And I think I'll start with it. We need real system alignment. And what I mean by that is we know that there are many systems that work with and through the social sector, ultimately for people, communities, families, things like education and health and public health and housing and employment and justice work alongside and with the social service sector. And yet we know they're not well aligned. Our federal, our state, our local policy could foster much better conditions and have a much greater impact on the ground. And, it's connected to the way that we think about what it is that anybody needs to live their lives and be healthy and well. That's how services are delivered the best, is when we really are thinking about it from that person, family, community base. And so when I talk about system alignment, there's lots of things that have happened over the last few years, and some really incremental positive adjustments, federal policy and state policy. But I think all of us who work in the space, it's far too little progress and too slow. And the fact of the matter is, we have a lot of laws and guidance that is not consistent across sectors. It doesn't leverage resources in the best possible way. And to me, the game changer in that alignment comes when we see investments as a through line to the organizations who are most proximate to people. Those trusted places like Lutheran Social Services and so many others that are proximate, close to the ground, part of community. To me, that's the fuel that gets us there. And I'll give you an example of how it plays out in policy. There's been a lot of focus on how we modernize our technology systems as a tool. And, how do we create more efficiently people's access and knowledge of what might be able to support them through a particular time of need or advance their families' kind of social and economic mobility? And we had policies over the last decade that have enhanced federal match, and federal match is essentially what the federal government might contribute relative to a state in order to invest in new technology and improve things like eligibility systems and other ways that programs interface with people on the ground in a set of services. But what we missed in all of that was a policy mechanism for extending those investments beyond the public sector agency. I mean, if we're going to have a true connection of information about what's happening in a community and the people who make it up and what's needed in terms of that kind of continuum of services, we have to be thinking about community based organizations. And the same could be said about the workforce. Again, something we've already talked about. But, if you had reimbursement policies for training and development that could extend to the social services workforce out in community, and government saw that as an extension, really, of how they get their work done. To me, those kind of infrastructure investments could be absolute game changers if you couple them with that alignment that we really need on the various kinds of ways that our laws ultimately impact how we do service delivery.
Thank you, Tracy. So, making sure that we can get the funding closest to those organizations that are proximate to the people is one insight that I hear you share. But that's difficult, right? Do you do that at the expense of government and maybe programs that they are running? Or so, how do you do that? What is the fuel, and what is the fuel to get us there?
Yeah, I think we have to. I mean, first we have to recognize that we as a country have underinvested in the power really of human services and social services, and that when there's access to information and when there's alignment across those sectors, the return on that investment is tremendous, because you're moving upstream. You're meeting families before any harm can happen to them, or you're intervening early enough to mitigate that stress on a family. And so I think we have to have the long version, the vision to think about it for the long term, because otherwise we'll constantly be in this circle of, oh, but then you're going to take resources from me to give it to somebody else. And really, we need an increased set of resources and a recognition that over time we are actually going to have a greater impact on the ground because we've shifted resources. I think there are other things we could talk about in the funding mix, and maybe we'll get to around the way we think about the philanthropic partners, role in this, as well as how to leverage the most of our resources. But I realize it's big, but I feel like if we don't go big and we don't make those kind of systems alignment, we will always have this incremental set of changes that are having a positive impact on the ground, but we'll lack that kind of transformational power we want to see.
Thank you. What do you think governments can do to just move more quickly to address the needs of community based organizations? And we know there's lots of barriers. There's partisan politics, there's lack of funding, there's external forces. But even in the midst of those challenges, what can we do to address the needs of community based organizations?
Well, most immediately, right, like what's right in front of us right now is state and localities have to be intentional about how they're using American Rescue Plan Act dollars. these are still being allocated across the nation. There's a lot of states with legislatures who are meeting right now and having these kind of conversations. And there's an opportunity to make some of those thoughtful investments that I just talked about is important to kind of policy decisions to extend to that social sector and think about ways that we support the social and social services on the ground in modernizing the infrastructure with really what's been a once in a generation opportunity through some of those dollars. But I'll step back a second and think about this in a little bit more fundamental way, which is I think if we're going to scale and sustain change and talk about it in a way that's going to unleash really the full power of the human services and social services sector, I think leaders from a public sector perspective have to recognize the formal power they sit with. It's inherent, right, in just being part of a government system. And we have to start asking ourselves, and I mean the we here as public service, human service leaders, have to be able to explicitly name what are the power imbalances and do we even understand how power is dispersed and where the imbalances lie and what kind of assessment are we thinking about in our own organizations to say, are we really in a place to co discover with folks on the ground what is most needed, where to put our energies, where to put those limited resources? It goes back to the question you were just asking around, how do you does that mean that government has to give something up? And I think partly my answer is yes. In that, and part of it giving up is not as much sometimes in resources as that is in how are you making decisions? Have you created feedback loops that bring leaders who are most proximate to community into program and service design? How are you doing that? What is what is required to make that possible? And I use the term co-discovery intentionally because I think over years of talking with leaders who are much better at this than I on the ground, who are really kind of thinking through too often we think about, well, how are we going to solve it? But the problem is we don't even really know what the root cause is. And so we have to be willing to be more transparent and co discover really what is needed. And that takes some time. So I said, I said I was going to back up a second, I think sometimes to go faster, we have to slow down enough to say, what are we actually spending time on? And that, it's building relationships as trust building process is social, it's relational, it takes time and it takes intentionality. And I think we have got to create the space for that to happen. And I mean the collective we from whichever sector we're coming from.
Thank you, Tracy. And the word that really intrigues me that you use is co-discover. I really like that word. We have a similar word that we use as part of our values here at LSS, and it's co-creation. And we really believe that how can we co-create internally with our teams and with our boards, but also with our partners to yield the best outcome where voices are heard from both sides of the aisle. And government, nonprofit, to really realize the best returns for the people we serve. So thank you for that insight. That concludes round two. In round three, we're going to discuss how philanthropy can play a bigger role in helping our sector and addressing broader social determinants of health. Okay, Tracy, you ready for round three?
You know I am.
All right, let's go. How are you seeing philanthropy playing a role in addressing the immediate and long term needs to improve health and well being?
Well, I think the short answer is I see it evolving along with government and the social services sector. Philanthropy has to evolve too. And I speak with a lot of folks who work with philanthropy and national funders regularly. And, the experience of the pandemic, the racial justice movement, they really illuminated more clearly for all of us, including many of those leaders, that we have to consider how philanthropy can help accelerate what we all know is needed and recognize that things like traditional grant cycles can't solve generational societal issues, right? You can't have a 2-year grant and discover everything you need to discover and solve everything that needs to be solved in a community. And so I think philanthropy is thinking about how it needs to be more agile in today's ever evolving world, taking a hard look at their own practices and asking, how do you make the most of investments in ways that can bolster and accelerate that positive impact. And I guess I'll just leave it at this that, we, I think, have long thought that the philanthropic investments can help jumpstart new ideas, maybe give us some seed funding for innovation. But by also, at the same time that you're testing something, committing to providing that kind of long term support needed to build capacity in the field, ensure community voice is able to be there and that kind of co-design co-creation that you just talked about is really important, and I am hopeful, as hopeful I think as I've ever been, that philanthropy is starting to see where it can really be an accelerant to change.
That another valuable insight about these grant cycles, you cannot address a generational issue in 2 years, and it just makes it difficult to really obtain that long-term funding to move the needle forward. A great insight. So we have, philanthropists, individual donors. I think there's a lot of flexibility with those individual donors, and many of us nonprofit organizations are trying to cultivate those relationships. But these are long-term relationships, and those funding opportunities don't materialize as quick as we'd like, right? To continue to do the work that we need to do to improve health and well-being. What other partners besides individual donors do we involve in the discussion to, again, help us move that needle, help us address these multi-generational issues that we're confronted with?
Yeah, I think it's really a whole of community approach, right? People often talk about whole of government, and I really want to change that phrase to whole of community in the sense that it really takes a lot of folks to come to the table. There's, social enterprise type of organizations. There's, private companies that can be really helpful, and they can be helpful in their individual donor status, but they can be also helpful in the broader context of really saying, well, what am I doing to give back to my community? How am I thinking about that? And how am I thinking about it also, again, in that longer term lens? I think government has, for all the reasons I've already shared, has to think about how it's investing in communities in a different way. And also recognize that some of the ways to cultivate longer term relationships and funding support that can supplement and accelerate what's happening in a community happens when there is a public private partnership at the table, right? And when those relationships have been built and cultivated, and they can generate more. I think I know you interviewed Susan Dreyfus, who's a longtime friend and colleague, but she often talks about there's a place where all that time you've spent in the relationship, it's kind of like a flywheel, right? It really accelerates, and all of a sudden, folks are really understanding and seeing what's happening in their community, and it brings more people in. And so I think also, celebrating those things more. And it goes back to the narrative we talked about as well. If people understand the sector and its actual impact in community in the ways you and I might know it, but maybe the broader public doesn't, that's a huge way for us to also try to elevate and make visible just how important the sector is and why investing in it for the long run is a winning situation.
Thank you. What are some creative ways that government and CBO, community based organizations, are working together to co create new solutions, innovations for the people we serve? What have you seen out there that can inspire us?
Yeah, I think I shared a few earlier that were really specific to the past couple of years and the pandemic. But I'll lift up a couple of things. One is just something that's more general, but it's where I've seen it happen. It's very cool, and that's that communities are using these what they call data walks as a way to undertake a challenging issue or to think about how they're going to advance economic mobility or think about something maybe more specific even than that in their with their families like youth graduation rates or something like that by literally bringing the data they have from public sector community organizations and people with lived expertise who are part of that community to do a data walk to see it visually displayed in front of them to then have conversations together as youth and parent leaders and community leaders and public sector leaders and thinking about okay, so what is that data telling us? What do we know? What do we not know? How do we interpret it? What do we need more of? And using that as a building block to make real outcome focused strides in their in what they're trying to undertake in that community. And then one other thing I'll share, Hector, is the state of Oklahoma. And this has been over the last couple of years during the pandemic, but they really sought out community leaders, local philanthropy in their state, to ask them about how they thought they should invest federal and state dollars and co-design a transformational pathway of hope, as they put it, a transformational pathway of hope for families, kind of building a coordinated strategic approach to leveraging that public-private partnership. And what's resulted is kind of they've shifted from a traditional project-based way of thinking about the work by really going again to organizations that are closest to the ground, making some of those power dynamic shifts so that they're in the state of co-discovery. And if you talk to leaders, just this is fresh on my mind because I've been in communication with leaders about it lately. It's truly created some major shifts, and now they're building field capacity in community organizations in ways that are directed at areas of most need and are really accelerating. So I think there's more to learn from them is there because they're early in their journey, but it's exactly the kind of thing that I think we need more of.
Thank you again, Tracy, for all your great insights. That concludes this round. But before we take off, I want to ask you, how are you knocking out 2022, both personally and professionally?
Oh, I love this question. I think I'm knocking it out by reconnecting, finding ways to reconnect for myself, which in my case tends to be reading, finding time to read, which I love to do, reconnecting with my families and friends. So having a few trips planned, which is really exciting, and getting to see people. I was able to see my dad at the first part of the year, and it had been just far too long, and it was just so important to be able to spend time with him. And then reconnecting with colleagues across the country. We're getting really excited to be hosting some events a little later this year in person and finding ways outside of our Zoom settings to just be with people and get caught up. So that's my knocking it out in 2022.
That's awesome. I love the reconnecting, especially right now after COVID. And I don't know about you, but I'm zoomed out and I like to be with people. And I hope that I can be close to you soon, maybe at an upcoming conference.
That
So
would be
that
great.
concludes our final round, Tracy. You knocked it out. You did an absolutely outstanding job. Thank you so much for all you do for the sector. Thank you so much for being on the show. And thank you for your friendship.
Thank you, Hector.
Thank you, Tracy, very much for your great insights. I just want to summarize a few of the key points that I heard you share that I think are very insightful and worth repeating. We need better cross sector relationships and collaborations. Government, philanthropy, community-based organizations, persons with lived experience coming together to address our most complex challenges. This negative narrative that sometimes exists within our sector needs to be addressed and talked about. And ultimately, we need to do away with that type of thinking. You talked about this distrust that exists within government. We need to talk about that head on in order for us to have relationships and collaborations so that we have and can obtain the trust we need in order to move our the health and well-being of those that we serve. Help some of the positive things you talk about, just human services and community leaders coming together to co-create and design something that will improve the lives of those most in need. This movement towards upstream and return on investment related to prevention. Let's try to address these issues early so that we can prevent further challenges from happening in the future. We have to modernize our infrastructure. Philanthropy also needs to evolve. This idea of working within the traditional 2-year cycle model, where we're trying to address intergenerational challenges that have existed for many, many years, was a great insight. The last thing, these data walks, I really love it, where we can kind of see that client through a time and period and try to see how we can improve the system for those individuals. Over the next couple of months, I'm going to dig a little deeper into these issues with some CEOs that are innovating on behavioral health, mergers and acquisitions, and also healthcare partnerships. I think we're going to all be very inspired by everything that they are doing. You can find out more about In the Ring with Hector Colon podcast and all of our episodes on our website, lsswis.org/inthering. Let us know what you think about it, and if you have any ideas for future episodes. Please like, follow, and share at LSSWIS, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any of these exciting conversations in the future. All right. Thank you, Tracy. And to all of our listeners, until next time, con mucho cariño, with much affection. Bye.